All right. Welcome back to what I'm sure will be a nightmare of an episode. I'm John,
And I'm Maddie.
and we are going to be talking about feminism, gender roles, and um, interesting trends that emerge from both feminism and gender roles, specifically with autistic women. Um, yeah, this is going to be an interesting episode. Hopefully, it is interpreted in the spirit of charity in which I intended to make it. Hopefully, we'll see how it goes. This is our third time recording this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the first two did not make it through my first editor's pass. So um, hopefully this time it will. We shall see. Um,
What
yeah,
a weird energy to start this on.
yeah. This is certainly an energy to start this on.
You're already
A
on stress.
choice, a choice. We're already making great time. So, yeah, this episode is going to touch on topics that are extremely hot in the culture war. In this episode, we are going to be talking specifically about anti-trans positions that are held by autistic people and why they hold them. Again, these positions are common in autistic Christian circles, so they need to be described because this is a simple reality of what the situation is. Description is not endorsement, but some of these descriptions, again, might feel like a bit of a personal attack in these very turbulent culture war times. Um, Understand, I'm not attacking you. I am not wishing to attack you. This is not what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is describe ethnographic trends within the autism Christian community. For this episode, I'm also probably not going to talk in terms of hard percentages. For some of the things, I will, just because they're much easier to track than others. But in a lot of cases, as I'm sure we will discuss, figuring out numbers is actually really, really hard. And the numbers will shift significantly over time, and they will also shift based on how you ask the question and how you word the question. And so asking people about their support for trans issues and just saying, are you trans affirming broadly? And then asking them a specific question will change the answers completely. So I'm probably not going to give really large percentages for some of these things, mostly because things are in flux and these numbers are going to change within 6 months. I If you ask me how they're going to change, I would probably say not in a way that most people will like, but they will change. So, spoiler for this upcoming episode. So, just another reminder, unless I explicitly state otherwise, when I'm talking about autistic people, I am only talking about Christians. I am not talking about non Christians. Non Christian autistics on these subjects are very, very different from autistic Christians, as far as I have been able to tell. And again, a lot of times people aren't thinking about these things extremely deeply. They're kind of shooting from the hip and just going with that. So don't always consider these opinions deeply held, philosophically pondered positions. These are what they told me in interviews, which aren't always some things that they've spent a lot of time talking about. As I mentioned last episode, there's a lot of discourse, especially when it comes to trans issues, that's out there, and not a lot of it is great. A lot of people say a lot of things for political reasons rather than for accurately reflecting the available data that exists reasons. And oftentimes, especially when you mix autism in with it, there is a lot of there are a lot of people who make very hard pronouncements on things they don't understand, either because they don't understand autism or they don't understand trans issues. And yeah, we aren't going to feed into that, hopefully. I say we're not going to feed into that, but yeah. If you're coming to this episode and you are looking for a trans bashing podcast, this is not it. If you are coming to this episode looking for a turf bashing podcast, this is also not it.
We're super neutral.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
We're
Remember,
conveying
we hold
information.
your positions.
Yeah, we agree with you.
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah, so I know many people on all the different sides we're about to describe. I know many trans autistic Christians. I know many autistic Christians who are anti-trans. This podcast is not about bashing these various sides. This podcast is about trying to understand why autistic Christians come to the positions that they come to. At this point, I think I have listened to so many of the people from both sides of varying degrees that I could effectively emulate any side of the debate at any level of unhinged that you would like me to. I have interviewed so many people and talked to so many people about these issues that I have a very, very good idea of what they will say and where they will come from. I've also done just a lot of reading on these issues. So I was initially very ignorant of these things, like what does an autistic army officer in computer engineering ever need to know about trans issues? Literally nothing. But when I started getting deeper into this podcast, I realized that actually I had to understand these things really well because it was a thing that kept coming up over and over and over and over and over. Now, whenever someone asks me about trans things and I give them an answer, they will usually say, "Oh, you don't understand. You haven't read enough, or you haven't watched it." Now,
And do more reading, John.
yes, there is a chance you are right. There is a chance that I haven't read something that you're about to recommend me. However, at this point, I have read most things that people will recommend. Like, I have read Julia Serrano, I've read Judith Butler, I have been in the Tumblr trenches. I know what all the words mean. I've watched Philosophy Tube. I've watched Jesse Gender. I bought a Nebula subscription, and for those who don't know me, this is out of character, particularly for me. But I bought a Nebula subscription so I could watch pro-trans YouTubers talk about this topic, so that I could better understand it. Conversely, I have also read all the things on the other side. If there is a turf talking point out there that exists, I have probably read it. I probably know which book it comes from or which blog it comes from. I have watched the Daily Wire's documentary, What is a Woman?
I was about to say that one.
Yeah. Don't worry. I've watched it. You don't need to tell me to watch it. You don't need to tell me to look up Ray Blanchard or any of the stuff around Ray Blanchard.
But have you looked up Ray Blanchard?
I in fact have more than probably most people have any reason to. I have read everything that Jesse Singal has written about trans youth gender medicine. I even subscribed to the Blocked and Reported podcast so I could hear everything that he was saying about transgender youth medicine, because everyone asks me about these things all the time. This is not a special interest of mine. I'll just put that out there. This isn't a special interest of mine.
You were just putting in the work.
This is the only reason I do this is because I get so many questions about this, and I feel like because so much is at stake in these issues, I need to be the most informed, and I need to understand what's going on, because so many people ask me these questions. So, while it is possible that I haven't read something, or I haven't seen a blog or watched a video that you're about to send me, there's a very good chance that I've watched something similar to it, or that I understand what's going to be said in it. At this point, there's very little that surprises me, and because so many people constantly come to me asking these questions, I have had to read about this and do way more in-depth research than I probably normally would have to do. So, all of this is to say, I have put in the work. I have put in the hours. This is not just some random guy talking about this. This is this is me trying to explain a very complicated, very fraught issue with a very high culture war temperature here. I'm trying to do my best to describe what the actual reality is, not the sort of narratives that you get from both sides. This is a very complicated topic.
Hopefully, everyone can hear the nervousness in your voice, and so they know
Yeah.
not to like harass you.
Yes. um this is not an episode that I wanted to do. This is not one that I was planning on doing.
It was thrust upon you.
I got so many questions about it though from everyone. So that is the preamble intro to this episode.
Take a breath, John. You'll be all right.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully. So this is only being done because I've got so many people asking about it or talking about it or people asking me about it. And
Mhm.
instead of having this conversation 30 times in private, I am just going to have it once in public and then point people to this video.
Oh, you're gonna have it in private too. That's not gonna stop.
Oh yeah, no, it's not going to stop in private. Yeah, we'll get into that. So the three topics related to this that we need to get into for this is basically understanding autistic attitudes towards gender roles, autistic attitudes towards feminism, and then finally autistic attitudes towards trans people. Again, autistic Christian, I should clarify. So, let's start with the easiest one, gender roles.
So
Overall,
easy.
autistic Christians are not a big fan of gender roles. The broad, overarching sweep of it is not a fan, especially if they're women. So, autistic women are very, very likely to mention without being prompted that they don't like gender roles, or that they don't like the gender roles assigned to them, or that they don't like the idea and the concept without me even having to ask them. It's something that comes up very frequently and very quickly. And it's also something that they post a lot about on social media. If you
Oh
find
yeah.
an autistic woman and you want to know what they think about gender roles, just like talk to them and wait 5 minutes and you'll probably hear it. Now,
Scroll through
uh,
their posts for like a
yes.
minute.
scroll back through their posts for a week and you will probably find at least 5 different opinions on the topic. So, that being said, autistic men are also not big fans of gender roles, and the biggest thing is that autistic people in general are not a fan of what I call top-down gender roles, which is to say, socially enforced gender roles that are imposed upon people. There are other types of gender roles, ones that I will call bottom up gender roles. A bottom up gender role is a role that just happens to sort of naturally sort. Um,
Grassroots gender roles.
yes, grassroots gender roles, if you will. So grassroots gender roles, an example of this would be women tend to do most of the childcare in the very early stages of a baby's life, just because that's what happens with most children. My baby screamed whenever she wasn't with her mother. And yeah, there wasn't really much I could do. So that is a type of gender role. So autistic people really don't have much problem with that, or much problem with a person deciding that they want to adhere to a traditional gender role. The thing that they have a very big problem with, and the thing that is generally overall a very big problem for autistic people, is when people say, you are a girl, therefore you must do X, or you are a boy, therefore you must do Y. There is a very strong autistic impulse to say no, because autistic people are, by default, meritocratic egalitarians, as we have been saying for the last 3 episodes. That is the overall sweeping trend for autistic people is default meritocratic egalitarianism. And so if an imposed social role doesn't fit into that category, they are unlikely to care about it, or they are unlikely to actually want to force anyone if they don't fit the mold. I have met very few autistics who actually like gender roles or think they're a good thing to be applied generally. There are many autistics who will see gender roles and be like, yeah, this is just what makes sense for me and my husband because of what our life looks like. Or, yeah, this is how me and my wife work it out because that's it. It just kind of made the most sense. You know, I'm a software engineer. She's a stay at home mom. I make all the money. She raises our 4 kids. It's just what makes sense for us. I wouldn't be very good at that. She's very good at that. She does all the homeschooling, that type of thing.
Right.
However, they're also very quick to say, I recognize that this won't work for everyone, and I understand why you wouldn't want to do this. The only reason I'm doing this is just because it happens to be the thing that makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, one of the comments, especially the comment you get from autistic women, is that gender roles are a prison. They do not like them. They do not like the imposition. They are not big fans of gender roles. Why don't they like gender roles? This is a very simple thing to explain. The ideals of what a man should be are, in every society, normed and formed around ideals and ideas of masculinity that are often based on men who aren't autistic. That
Mm.
is the easiest way to put it. So when you
Crazy.
think of an ideal man, that ideal man probably isn't autistic. And
Yeah.
so autistic men don't fit that mold very well. And the same thing goes for autistic women. And so within Christianity, the sort of ideal man that you should aspire to in most Christian settings is not a man with autism. It's usually a man who is very different from your average autistic person. And this is even more so the case with women.
Yeah. So, like most other social stuff, it's
Yes. Yes.
wow,
So,
crazy.
like most other stuff, gender roles are normed and formed around non-autistic people, and so autistic people, generally speaking, don't like them. And one of the reasons that you can tell this is true is that when autistic people make their own social rules and social roles, they like them. So
Mm.
if you go to places that are majority autistic, so like Silicon Valley tech companies,
Mm.
various fields in STEM, arts communities where you find lots of autistic people, they make roles and they like those roles and they like when you follow those roles and they don't like when you don't do it. They
Interesting.
essentially create roles, but they're just autistic roles and autistic norms. And if there were enough autistic men and autistic women in a concentration, I probably think they would probably make their own gender roles. They would just be autism gender roles. And they probably wouldn't look much like the ones we currently have. That being said, that scenario doesn't exist. And we don't have that. And what we do have are gender norms and gender roles that are normed around people who don't think like autistic people, who don't prioritize the things autistic people prioritize. And so overall, they find them very restrictive. They often say, I don't fit in this box. This doesn't apply to me. I just feel like I'm not like this type of person that you expect me to be. Again, especially autistic women. They're expected to be like mothers, to be socially compliant, to go into caring roles, or to
Yeah.
go into roles in which they are expected to do a lot of emotional work. And
Yeah.
they are not big fans of that emotional work.
Also,
Uh,
like organizing social events.
Yes, yes, they are expected to organize social events, and also the types of things that women and girls are expected to do are often the types of things that autistic women don't like to do. And a very very big thing that comes up is a lot of autistic women spend a lot of time wishing, especially growing up, they spend a lot of time wishing they were boys so they could do all the boy things. And
Yeah.
so yeah, like it's extremely common for autistic girls to be like, I wish I could be a boy because the boys get to do Bible study where I have to learn how to be a good wife, and I don't care about learning how to be a good wife. I want to be in the Bible study. Yeah, and like that's basically why. The reason that women are significantly more likely to chafe against gender roles than autistic men is because the gender roles for autistic women are just significantly heavier, and the weight of them presses on them significantly more. Women have the basically burden and duty of childbearing and child rearing and household management, which are all things that require a lot of executive function and a certain type of affect that most autistic women don't have. And so, yeah, and those things aren't expected of autistic men in the same way that they're expected of autistic women. And so, generally speaking, autistic women are a lot more vocal about how much they hate those roles. Also, the amount of career paths that are expected from a normal Christian woman and the career paths that are expected from a normal Christian man, very different. So, like, men have significantly more options than women. I remember talking to a lot of the autistic women that I served with in the military, and they basically said all of their families think they're either weird or bad because they joined the military.
Mm.
And yeah, no one thought I was weird or bad for joining the military. And it was just a normal expected thing for men, but not for women. And there's just more restriction for women. There's also just more in general repression, a sort of often an expectation that women are less intelligent and less thoughtful than men, or worse at math and things like that. And so they're not expected to do those types of things. And if they do those types of things, they're accused of not being a woman. There are a lot more negative stereotypes that apply to women than there are that apply to men. And so it just makes sense that you get what you get. So when we talk about attitudes towards gender roles, there are basically three categories. Well, I guess four. So the first category is what I will call a gender role abolitionist. The next would be a gender fatalist. And the third would be a gender role enjoyer. And then the fourth would be an unaligned, I don't really have a position about gender roles, who knows. That last category is exclusively male. I have
It's the
never heard a woman give that opinion. They are usually male and they're usually quite young. So, just to explain these three categories, gender abolitionists are the most common. They make up a very slim majority. They used to make up a much larger majority. So they used to make up around 70% of autistic people I surveyed prior to 2017. Since 2017, that number has been going down, or people have registered that they've changed their minds, and after that they tend to join what I call the gender fatalists. And
mm.
then finally, the gender role enjoyers are just people who actually like gender roles, and they're usually very conservative and male. So, gender role abolitionists, what do they believe? Lots of things. So, gender role abolitionists are a very large group of people that encompass a very wide political spectrum. Not everyone holds to these exact ideas that would fall into the gender abolitionist or the gender role abolitionist camp, but this should give you a pretty good idea of what these people tend to be like. They believe that most, if not all, gender roles that are given to people are socially constructed, imposed, and arbitrary. Like they would say, there's no reason that any person of a specific gender should have a specific role. They
Mhm.
often believe that gender roles have developed out of complex social phenomena that were intentionally built to suppress women. They believe that gender roles do not neatly apply to the gender complexity that exists in society, and especially gender complexity as it exists with autism. So a lot of people will say, look, gender roles might work. They don't work for me, and they don't work for people like me. There's a belief that gender roles impose arbitrary and unnecessary restrictions upon people in most cases and lead to harm, unnecessary restriction, and the denial of human potential. They also believe that it is actually possible to create a society in which gender roles no longer exist, or are, at least to a significant degree, less established than they currently are. So maybe we can get rid of gender roles altogether, or maybe we can get rid of most of them. And it would be a good thing if we did. They believe that Christian duty often entails the abolition of gender itself and gender roles as well with them. Because if you don't have gender, you can't have gender roles. They're often okay with gender roles in individual circumstances if the person agrees to them. Like if a person says, look, I like gender roles because they work for me, these people will be like, well, that's great. I'm glad it works for you. I don't care. Um, like you do what you want. All we're saying is this should not be imposed on anyone. And they're often quite optimistic. And they're quite optimistic about gender and the future and future trends. And there is this sort of idea with a lot of them that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards gender abolition and gender role abolition, or one or the other. That's what a
What
gender role abolitionist is. So gender roles exist, they shouldn't exist, and it's our duty to get rid of them.
I love
So the
their
next group.
positive mindset.
Yes. A marks for positivity
Yeah.
and optimism. Speaking of optimism, or a lack thereof, you have the next camp, which I have called the gender fatalists. So this camp were very small when I started to survey autistic people. So in 2014 to 2017, this was a very small percentage of autistic people. It has grown much larger, and it's mostly grown from people leaving the gender role abolitionist camp. It's also grown from some gender role enjoyers who've just kind of grown up a bit, I guess. Usually a gender role enjoyer, as they grow older and as they mature, they'll develop different ideas about gender roles. It's just how it is.
The cynicism creeps in.
Yes. So, gender fatalists, what are they? One of the first things that you need to understand about them is they are mostly biological gender essentialists. So, what a gender essentialist is a person who believes that there is some sort of inescapable component to gender and sex. So, they usually will say something to the effect of humans are sexually dimorphic, and while there are exceptions, they're rare. And biology and its constraints are not easily escapable, if escapable at all. And you can try to escape your biology, but you won't. You'll attempt to. Will it work out? Probably not in the long run. They're, like I said before, they're often disaffected gender abolitionists. They frequently refer to themselves as gender optimists mugged by reality. And they'll say things like, I used to be really optimistic about it, and they'll tend to be a bit older than gender abolitionists, and they'll say I used to be really optimistic about it, and then I had kids, and then I realized that, oh, that's why things are like this. Now, that being said, gender fatalists do not believe in top-down gender role imposition. What they believe, however, is that while many gender roles are socially constructed, we as a society will inevitably recreate many gender roles because of the constraints of human biology, and that human biology, like nature itself, does play a role in things, and it plays a much more significant role that maybe a lot of us were willing to give it credit for, and maybe there are just some inescapable components here. They often describe themselves as pragmatists, and when they are, so another big group of people who join the gender fatalist groups are autistic women who come from conservative spaces. and they come from conservative spaces, and they have a high proximity to like male abuse and male violence. And so they're not willing to go full gender abolitionist, but they are willing to say, okay, a lot of gender roles are dumb and they are socially constructed. However, some of these things exist for a reason. So some gender roles should be abolished and overcome, like women not being able to be in the workforce would be one of them, or not being able to take certain jobs would be one of them. But many of these roles sort of can't be overcome. So one thing that you'll often get when you talk to these people is they will talk about pregnancy and how we can't really make society equal because only one half of society gets pregnant and only one half of society can have babies. We need babies to exist as a species. We need babies to take care of the elderly.
True, yes.
We need human reproduction. It is
Number
just
one reason to
a
have babies, take care of the elderly.
yes. I mean, like it is important for these people that these things are taken into account. And so one of the things that gender fatalists will often say is there's a reason that gender roles are split the way they are. And while a lot of them are dumb, some of them are not. And what we need to do is not try to have a sort of gender agnostic equality, but what we need is equality between the sexes that accounts for a lot of these biological realities that many people like to pretend don't exist. So these people will often be very into things like long paid maternity leave, specific funding for women who are staying at home raising children, having motherhood as a paid role, things like making motherhood very high status. They'll talk a lot about things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And they will often talk about things that, like, look, equality of outcome is pretty much impossible because men are bigger, stronger, and women are more vulnerable. That's just kind of what we have to acknowledge. And we're different. We think differently, we act differently. While there are differences and there are some similarities, there are a lot of differences, and we can't make a society in which you're going to have an equality of outcome. So, like I said, these people are very invested in a sort of biological essentialism. They're very invested in the idea that human biology is really important and we can't get away from it. And there's a very heavy emphasis on specific biological functions that are separate between males and females. And again, mostly they will cite childbearing and child rearing, but they'll also cite male brains versus female brains, and male muscle distribution versus female muscle distribution, and male sexuality versus female sexuality, and size,
Ooh,
and things like that.
yeah.
Yeah, so these people are often um, sort of gender critical feminist or gender critical feminist adjacent as well.
Mm.
They are often, um, let's say, not as progressive as you might expect most autistic people to be based on the last few episodes. And they have grown significantly in the last 6-ish years. So, again, the gender fatalist position overall, they're like, look, humans are a sexually dimorphic species, and this sexual dimorphism is really important to understand if we are trying to build a fair and just society. We want to build a fair and just society, but we do need to acknowledge the realities of human sexual dimorphism and account for them. And this will probably lead to gender roles as sort of naturally shaping out. We should not try to pretend those gender roles don't exist. We should not try to pretend these things don't exist. We should instead try to account for them instead. So that is that position. And finally, we have the easiest one to understand, which is gender role enjoyers. Actually, no. The easiest to understand are the unaligned because they're kind of confused about everything and don't hold strong opinions. The next easiest one to understand is the gender role enjoyer. So the gender role enjoyers are usually very conservative. They are still very uncommon in conservative autistics. So like even conservative autistics will often be like, yeah, I'm not a big fan of gender roles. This isn't my thing. Although more conservative, heterodox leaning or like rationalist autistics will usually be in the gender fatalist camp, not the gender role enjoyer camp. It's pretty straightforward. It's like the default trad Christian position. Basically, they're hard gender essentialists. They believe that God has a design for both genders that's separate and distinct. Men should lead women. Patriarchy exists and it's a good thing. We should have benevolent patriarchy. We should There's a very high expectation of social conformity, and they believe that men and women have separate and distinct roles, and the closer we follow to these roles, the happier we'll be. And not conforming to gender roles will lead to misery in the long term because you are going against God's design for men. And that's the gender role enjoyer position.
Yeah.
So
You know them. You love them. You've seen them around. They're
they're
exactly
your
what you
parents.
expect.
No.
They're your parents. Yeah. They're
I'm just
everyone
kidding.
above 50.
Yes. They're not actually my parents. I think my parents were some of the OG gender fatalists. That is gender roles. Do you have any questions?
uh, no, I think they're covered. Hopefully
Great.
everyone felt seen and heard by that explanation.
Yes. If you are a little confused about what either of those categories are, uh,
Do some Googling. I don't know.
I don't think gender fatalist is an actual term. I think that's just one I
Oh,
made
did
up to
you make
describe
that
these
one?
people.
Okay, that's good. You need to lead with that. Like tell people which terms you made up.
Yeah, that's fair.
You have had to like you've like created your own language to
Yeah,
describe the things you found. It's very impressive.
it do be like that sometimes. Anyway, autism and feminism.
Mm.
Fun.
Yeah, I mean, got touched on a little bit throughout the gender role type people.
Yep, it did.
So you probably won't say anything too surprising.
Hopefully not. Um, Feminism is really, really hard to track in autistic Christians.
Mm,
And it's really hard to track for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that in a lot of Christian spaces, feminism is a dirty word.
makes
Like,
it hard.
feminism is a word that you accuse other people of being, mostly other women of being, when they're not conforming to what you want, or when
Mm.
they're not doing what you want, or when they're being difficult. People will say, oh, she's being a feminist. And so, in a lot of cases, feminist is a pejorative that you don't want to be and you don't want to be associated with.
It's like interchangeable with Jezebel spirit, right?
Yes, yeah, it is basically used in a lot of Christian spaces for woman I don't like. So if you ask a woman who's in one of those spaces, are you a feminist? It's like asking, are you a woman that's bad? um, so it is kind of hard to track these trends.
Are you?
However,
That's bad. Yeah.
I mean, that is what it's like. However, it is a lot easier to track by just asking very specific questions about what you think about the sort of statuses of men and women. And if you ask those specific questions without saying the word feminism, you can get a lot better data.
Mm.
Another problem is that in progressive spaces, it is a very, very good word. And so you
Mm.
want to be a feminist.
You want to be a feminist. It means
And
it's the equivalent of asking, "Are you a good person?"
yes, yes. And so a lot of people in progressive spaces will say, "Of course I'm a feminist." A lot of progressive men will be like, "Yeah, I'm a feminist," and then hold some pretty misogynistic views or not really fall in line with any normative school of feminism. Not only that, feminism means a ton of different things. There is no real static definition of feminism or what it means or what it implies. And there are better described as schools of feminism. So, I'm going to talk about these three schools of feminism and I'm going to define them and go into more detail. The three schools of feminism that I'm going to talk about are liberal feminism, progressive feminism, and radical feminism. So, liberal feminism is a system of thought related to feminism which seeks to advocate for rights of women in pursuit of equality with men on the basis of the liberal idea of human rights. When you're talking about feminism in common parlance, this is what feminism means. If someone says that they're a feminist, in most cases, this is what they're saying. It is a fairly wide range of beliefs, but basically, they believe that women have been denied rights and freedoms on the basis of sex oppression that are available to men, but not to women. These rights that have been denied to women should be extended to men in order to make them equal. The goal is to pursue fairness between sexes through reforms of the current system. They believe men can be feminists. In fact, they believe everyone can be feminist, and that feminism is for men just as it is for women.
For men, like men can participate in being that.
Yes.
Okay.
Men can participate and be a feminist, and a man should be a feminist because all that means is that he wants equal rights for women. Or he wants equality for women. Generally speaking, liberal feminists are open to the idea of things like gender transition, and they're generally speaking very accepting and welcoming of non-binary and trans people, and respecting the ideas of gender identity. The goal of this form of feminism is sort of to bring the rights of women in line with the rights of men, and to ensure that women have freedom of choice, and to fight for women's equality with men. They basically want to create a society in which your gender does not inhibit you, and you are not discriminated against on the basis of sex, because you have the same rights that any other person of a different sex or gender would have. That's what liberal feminism is. Progressive feminism, or intersectional feminism, or like third, fourth wave feminism, depending on how you want to talk about it. It started.
Is that third / fourth, or like third and fourth?
It's third and fourth wave.
Where are we at? Which wave?
I believe we're on 4.
Okay. That's the most up-to-date version.
I get confused at all the patch notes, and I haven't kept up to date. I checked the feminism GitHub, and I was seeing the commit history, and it just wasn't making a lot of sense to me. Anyway, so the labeling of waves is mostly like a convention of historiographers, and various people disagree on when second wave started, and when third wave started, and when fourth wave started, or if we're currently on a fifth wave of feminism.
Oh, wow. But, I checked out around the Women's Bible, so I haven't kept up with all the waves.
That's staying in.
That should stay in. That was a good joke.
Yeah, it was. That was a great joke.
Thank you.
So progressive or intersectional feminism has its roots in the 20th century, but got mostly popular and mostly popularly adopted in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. When you think of a sort of like BuzzFeed feminism, you're probably thinking of something like progressive feminism or intersectional feminism. Some people would say that's liberal feminism. Anyway, this is where the definitions get really complicated and kind of annoying.
Isn't this, I find a lot of this just ends up coming down, you can leave this in if you want. I find a lot of this ends up coming down to like, I like this, so I'm going to sort it into my kind of feminism, or I don't like this, so I'm going to sort it into the other kind of feminism.
That is very common, yes. And
feminists aren't the only ones who do that. Yeah. A lot of people do that, but they do a lot.
Depending on how far left you are, liberal eventually becomes an insult, and then on the right, liberal is definitely an insult.
There you go.
And so basically, progressive feminism seeks to correct errors of other types of feminism by understanding oppression and equality, not just along the lines of gender and sex, but along lines of race, class, disability, and sexual orientation, etc. So they would say, look, if you are a woman who's white and upper class, you are going to experience oppression differently than a woman who's black and lower class. And so feminism can't be naive to all these differences. And so what we need to do is look at the different axes of oppression that you experience. And that basically turns into many different feminisms that are separated along different intersectional lines with the goal of addressing the needs of the most oppressed people. And the idea of this type of feminism is to liberate these oppressed people from gender oppression amongst other things. So you can't just liberate someone from gender oppression. It needs to be, you need to consider all the different intersections of oppression that someone faces. And so, if you were to look at most modern progressive rhetoric, you would probably find that that's what would be described as a sort of progressive feminism. It differs from liberal feminism in that liberal feminism is really just focused on women as a class or a category and giving them legal rights and human rights in the sort of legal framework. This is a sort of more holistic approach that includes all different types of categories. Finally, there is radical feminism. So this is a term I hear getting misused all the time, and it drives
Oh,
me
yeah.
insane.
That's surprising. I'm surprised
Yeah.
people misuse that term.
So people think radical feminist means really feminist or very vocal about feminism. That's not what radical feminist means.
Yeah.
Radical feminism is a specific school of feminist thought. And when people use the term radfem, it has very specific types of implications.
People do like to throw it around, though. So,
They do. And I recently interviewed an autistic man who described his autistic sister as a radical feminist. And then I interviewed his sister, and she was very much not a radical feminist. She was a intersectional feminist. Um, yes. Anyway, people don't
mhm.
understand what it means. So radical feminism, often associated with the second wave of feminism, is a system of thought that sees men and women as classes in a state of conflict in which men are oppressing women. And the goal of radical feminism is to liberate women from the oppression of men. To many people, radical feminists often seem quite extreme. Radical feminism often, these days, has the connotation of transphobia. I want to be clear, it does not necessarily mean transphobia. While I will admit, there is an intersection. Um, just because you're a radical feminist doesn't mean you can't be trans inclusive, but it
True.
is still
There's a whole separate word for the ones that are trans exclusive. So,
so true, so
that's
true.
an add on. It's not the base
Yes,
model.
yes. And so it's a very fairly wide range of beliefs, but it's basically based in a sort of Marxist class analysis. But instead of having the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or like the capitalist class and the working class, they take that form of analysis and apply it to sex, and they see men as an oppressing force of women. They're often
That's
social
why they're radical.
constructivists. Yes, that is why they're radical. They're often social constructionists or gender essentialists. Um, what I mean by that is they often see gender as fixed, and there is some sort of inescapable there's an inescapable reality to the nature of sex that cannot be easily changed, and that you as a woman experience oppression on the basis of this sort of unchanging part of biology. They see men as an oppressor class that is self interested in maintaining dominance and control of women through a system of violence and coercive control. They see men and women as sort of stuck in a conflict, with men as the dominant oppressors and women as the victims of oppression and violence. And to be very clear, that doesn't mean they hate all men or they think all men are bad. when they say men, they're not talking about every individual instance of men. They are
Some of them.
saying men as a group. Well, even the ones who are saying yes, all men are saying men as a group and men as they operate and exist in society. So the oppression of women in this construct is called patriarchy or male supremacy, and the goal of radical feminism is to liberate women from male supremacy and patriarchal control. They will often say things like they will say things like gender-based oppression is the oldest form of oppression, and that men oppressing women is a sort of undeniable fact of reality that exists regardless of any of these other intersections. They will say, look, if you are a rich woman, you are still just as likely to be beaten by your husband, and you are still just as vulnerable to your husband as a poor woman. Sure, if you're rich, you have other ways of getting out, but just because you're rich or just because you're middle class doesn't mean the specter of male violence, patriarchal control, and dominance does not apply to you. They will often say that you can't really reform this system. Like, it's just sort of a system that will always incentivize men to oppress women, and that men fundamentally can't be feminist because they are sort of part of the problem and part of the matrix of patriarchal control and violence against women. They'll say, look, men can be interested in these ideas, they could be allies with us, but like they can't be feminists because you as a member of the oppressor class can't really join forces with the oppressors against yourself, or if you do, you're going to act in your own self-interest.
That feels like foreshadowing. You can cut that
It is. It is. Um, they will also see that they'll also usually say that misandry is cool, actually. So people
out.
will accuse them of hating men, and they'll be like, "Yeah, what of it?" um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's kind of how it is.
Yeah.
So the goal of radical feminism is to liberate women from the oppression of men. It is to dismantle the patriarchy. It is to destroy male supremacy, and it is to fight for women against men, or to fight against the oppression of females from males. They also really want to abolish gender in most cases because they see that as the means by which they get rid of gendered oppression. So, they will still very much believe in the reality of sex, but they will say that gender and the idea of gender and gender roles should be done away with. So, what is the distribution of feminism amongst autistic Christian demographics? I pose a few questions here. So,
Oh yeah.
what the first question that we'll talk about is, I think feminists sometimes make good points. How many people agree with this? Either slightly agree or strongly agree. Agree. For autistic Christian women, it's like 93%.
Mm.
Strongly, slightly or strongly agree. Politically left or liberal women are at a near 100%. You almost never see a neutral. It's almost always agree or strongly agree. Politically conservative women will be around 80-ish% in agreeing to some extent. Most conservative women will say things like, they have some good points, but I don't buy into their solutions overall, or I think sometimes they have a good diagnosis but a bad cure, things like
Mm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
For autistic Christian men, when you ask this question, around 70% will agree or strongly agree. If they are politically left or liberal men, it'll be near 100%. You almost never see a neutral, you almost never see a hard no. Politically conservative men, especially young politically conservative men, are likely to say hard no, and like feminism is the root of all evil and things like that. And they'll often be on the hard disagree side, but when you ask them to define or articulate what feminism is, or which feminist thinkers they've listened to or heard, or ask them to really define anything about feminism, they often really struggle. And so They're like, yeah, I hate feminism. You're like, what's feminism? I don't know. it They don't actually say I don't know. They usually say it's about hating men or something like that. But yeah, so take those numbers for what they are. They're not like, generally speaking, all they show is that most autistic people, and especially most autistic women, will say that feminists sometimes make a good point. If you don't say feminism, like if you don't say the key word feminism, and instead of
Mhm.
saying feminists sometimes make a good point, but you just say people who think this, and you list a feminist idea, are making a good point. The amount of people who will go from disagree to agree jumps significantly.
That's so
Um,
sneaky of you.
yes, yes. So asking or saying a person generally speaking believes these things. Do you agree with them or disagree with them? And if you just don't say the word feminism, the amount who will agree with them goes up significantly. So the next statement: I am a feminist. Do you agree with it? Strongly, not slightly, all those things. Basically, this is where the most meaningful fault lines around attitudes sort of break around specific cultural politics. So, if you are left, progressive, liberal, you will probably be more likely to identify as feminist versus conservative. It's not really an autism thing, it's more of a cultural political divide, especially in the United States. I've noticed in the UK it's very different, where in the UK, conservative women are far more likely to say they are a feminist. Sometimes denominations factor into things and skew the numbers, but mostly the biggest deciding line is where you fall politically, at least in the US. In the UK, it's a lot more complicated. Generally speaking, if you are in like a liberal church, like a theologically liberal church, you're more likely to agree with the statement, but that's just because more theologically liberal churches are also more politically left than or progressive than conservative churches and vice versa. So, to the statement, I am a feminist, 77% of women will slightly agree or strongly agree. And most autistic women who say disagree will disagree because they interpret feminism to mean something like radical feminism. And if you clarify, I'm specifically talking about liberal feminism or something else like that, the number jumps to 96%.
Oh wait, like their first assumption is that when you say, "Are you a feminist?" that you're asking them if they're a radical feminist. Is that just
Yes.
the vibe you give off, or do they always think that?
No. So if you've read a lot about feminism and you're an autistic woman, you probably have read a lot about feminism. If you're an autistic Christian woman, it's
Yeah.
just the reality of things. And so you know what you would disagree with far more than you
Mm-hmm.
would the average person. And so you might say, mm, am I a feminist? I don't know, because I know what feminists think about abortion, and I'm not sure I agree with this.
Right.
Or I know what the feminist position is on issue X, and have spent a lot of time thinking on it, and I think I diverge from them on that issue. So does that mean I'm a feminist? I
And
don't
if you're
really
autistic,
know.
you're more likely
Yeah,
to say no if you
yeah,
aren't sure. Yeah.
exactly. And so 77% of women will say slightly agree or strongly agree. But if you say, look, I'm not asking for your specific definition of what you think feminism is.
Mm.
I'm asking you, like, would other people call you a feminist, or would you broadly align with feminist ideas? And they're like, okay, yeah, they would. And so like it goes from 77% to like 96% for progressive and left autistic women. For Christian men, it's about 85%, which is, I think, the funniest stat of this whole thing, is that if you're left, liberal, or progressive, and you're a Christian woman, 77%, approximately 77%, will agree, but for men, 85% agree. So men are more like left, liberal, and progressive men are more likely to say, I'm a feminist. They are more likely to say, I'm a feminist, mostly because they don't understand what they're assenting to and what they're agreeing
Yeah.
to. they sort of think it means that, yeah, I think the genders should be equal. And that's
Right.
about as deep as their understanding of feminism goes. And so, because autistic women are usually much more well read, or at least autistic left progressive women are much more well read, they tend to be much more willing to say no because they know there's like a divergence and a difference. Whereas autistic men don't know that there is a part where they could disagree. And so they just say, yeah, I'm a feminist.
Well, yeah,
And
for them it's just like the "Are you a good person?" question, and they know they
literally,
should
yeah.
answer yes. Yeah.
The 15% who say no are usually men who are sort of radfem adjacent or sympathetic. And they will say, I'm not a feminist because I believe that a feminist is a radical feminist. And that's the best and most legitimate interpretation of feminism. And I also know that men can't be feminist under this definition. So, no,
I
I'm
love
not.
that for them.
What?
That's so considerate of them. They're
Yes.
like,
Yes. Um, yeah, so that's how the numbers fall. I just think that's a funny stat that more progressive men say they're feminists than women, mostly because they don't know what they're talking about.
excellent.
Uh, yeah, generally speaking, the older you get and the more formally educated you get, the more likely you are to agree with the statement, I'm a feminist, in left liberal progressive circles. And these numbers don't really increase a whole lot when you don't say what feminism is. They kind of stay pretty much stagnant. So, for politically conservative Christians, it is very hard to accurately sample this, just because conservatives sometimes use feminist to mean woman that I don't like,
Mm.
and that's about as far as it goes. And so asking, are you a feminist, is sort of like asking, are you a bad person who we don't like? No, I'm not. Uh, you know, and so these numbers are very hard to come by. If you don't say the word feminist and you just ask autistic Christian women, do you do you agree with a person who believes these types of things?
Mm.
Around 40% of autistic Christian women on the conservative side will say yes. Depending on which things you include that in that list, it can jump up to 60%. Autistic Christian men are at in conservative spaces are at like 15%. And generally speaking, the older and more formally educated you are, the more likely you are to agree to some extent, but only for women. So, more educated, older autistic men are not more likely to say that. More educated autistic women on the conservative side are more likely to say it.
Mm.
Again, this one's really hard to accurately sample, mostly just because in conservative spaces, feminism is a dirty word.
Hmm.
The
Although it seems
statement,
like that would be
go
like,
ahead.
it seems like that would almost be as difficult on the other side too, because it's like there's the whole swath of like people who say yes just because like without really knowing what
Yeah.
they're agreeing to, just because it's like, you know, a compliment.
Yeah, it is really hard to actually pin legitimate numbers down without like sitting down with someone and being like, okay, we're going to talk about your specific views on gender and gender relations for the next hour. Although I have done that
I
to
believe
people who
you.
will volunteer. So the statement, I am a radical feminist. The only people who agree with this statement are around 6% of autistic leftist Christian women. And I mean leftist as in they are usually on the left, not like liberal Hillary Clinton supporters, but like the Soviet Union was a good place type of type
Oh, yeah.
of left. Um, that far left. This is for a lot of reasons. The first one is radical feminism is really kind of obscure, and most people can't define radical feminism unless they actually know what they're talking about.
Fair.
Radical feminism is often also explicitly anti Christian. Like they see Christianity as patriarchal and one of the various forms of oppression that take gendered form, and they have a lot to say about specific Christian ideas of how women are treated and the status of women. And so
Right.
often radical feminists can be pretty explicitly anti-Christian. Now, that being said, there are a lot of schools of radical feminism thought that can be held by Christians, but there are a lot of ways of thinking about it which can't be easily reconciled with Christian teaching, especially when it comes to like Christian positions on things like marriage or abortion. There tends to be quite a bit of divergence. However, if you stop asking the question, I agree or disagree, I'm a radical feminist, and start asking, I'm sympathetic to many ideas in radical feminism, the numbers
Mm.
start changing. So if you
Ooh.
don't say, I'm a radical feminist, and you ask them something like, are you radical feminist adjacent? Or are you at least sympathetic to ideas within radical feminism? This
Right.
changes a lot. This is also really hard to pull because very few people actually understand what radical feminism is. And so usually I have to like take a second to like explain it with small words and bright colors to be like, this is what they believe, and these are all the things.
In a non-threatening
Many
way.
Yeah, and like many autistic women will not tell this to me right off the bat, especially if they're from progressive spaces, because especially in current contexts, radical feminism sometimes has implications of being trans exclusionary. It doesn't necessarily need to be trans exclusionary, but it does have those implications.
Right.
And a lot of autistic women don't know that they agree with ideas within radical feminism and have sort of just derived these ideas of radical feminism through nothing but like the sheer power of autism and interactions with Christian men.
That's so true.
And so like they will hold many ideas held by radical feminists and just not even be aware that they're holding these ideas or that these ideas are in concert with radical feminists.
They don't even
Um,
know their true power levels.
Yes, they are blissfully unaware. Many autistic women will only express their sympathies with radical feminism from behind anonymous or locked accounts on social media because they are in progressive spaces and they understand that there are some social implications, like they're afraid that people will label them a turf. And
Mm.
so they will often hide their power level. And it just, this one is really hard to get to, and you pretty much only get to it when you go to long form interviews and start asking them really specific questions and can start a back and forth dialogue. And they usually only tell you these things once they've developed a trust relationship with you.
Are
Yeah.
they is there the same fear? Like obviously we're kind of edging towards talking about trans issues, so we've mentioned turfs. Is there the same fear of being labeled a swerf, or are they like not?
Yes. In
Yeah, okay.
progressive spaces.
Yeah.
SWERF, for those who don't know, is sex worker exclusionary radical feminist, which I will add is a personal pet peeve of mine because that is a wildly inaccurate term. TERF is accurate. So TERF is accurate. They are trans exclusionary and they are radical feminist.
Yeah.
SWERFs are not sex worker exclusionary.
Mm.
They just aren't. You just don't understand their position. I'm sorry. Anyway, this
Wow.
is the one time I will say I don't hold your position. The term swerf is dumb. Um,
That's so funny.
that is the official position of this podcast. Um,
Okay, I'll get behind that. That's I
yeah,
agree. I'm throwing my
yeah.
agreement behind John on this one.
We are both in the swerf is a dumb word camp.
Swerf is a fake
So
word. Stop using it.
yeah. So all of this is to say these numbers are very loose and very tentative and should be held with an open palm, you know, subject to large margins of error and variation, and understand a lot of these numbers are taken from sort of interpolation and extrapolation. And while it's hard to get hard numbers and percentages, it's a sort of, this is roughly how things go. The only demographic that's really easy to figure out are like British autistic Christian women. They're actually pretty consistent on this, and they usually actually know what they're talking about these days, at least. They
Oh,
didn't
wow.
in 2014, but like right now, if you want a person who can accurately talk about radical feminism, autistic Christian women in the UK are pretty good at it. Um, yeah.
Good
So
for them.
distribution of things like I am sympathetic to many of the ideas of radical feminism. Again, this doesn't imply transphobia. It often does, but you can agree with many of the ideas of radical feminism and not be anti-trans.
Right.
So, another caveat, these numbers are in flux and rapidly change. And I think they are going to continue to change for reasons that we will talk about shortly. So, autistic men, if they are left, liberal, or progressive, are around 10 to 12%. The only discernible trend I have found is that these are men who have some sort of experience or proximity to sexual violence. So if you are a male and you either have friends who were sexually assaulted or are yourself involved in these types of things, often like autistic social workers, people like that,
Mm-hmm.
these are the people who are most likely to have some sort of sympathy to radical feminist ideas. For autistic women, in leftist autistic women, the numbers are around 45% of them would agree with the statement, very similar to I'm sympathetic with the ideas of radical feminism.
And
If you
going up
don't say radical feminism and you just explain the positions, the number jumps up to around 65%.
and climbing, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
65% and climbing. I expect these numbers to keep going up. Progressive women, so explicitly progressive, so progressive and explicitly know that they're progressive, it's around 15% will say, yeah, I agree with these ideas in radical feminism, and they will often say I disagree because there are implications about transgender identity that they don't like. So in progressive circles, it's around 15% when you just survey them. When you start to build and develop trust relationships with them, it can move up to around 40%. I don't know the exact numbers. It's really, really hard to nail this one down because, as we'll get to later, a lot of them, once they get to know me, will revise their answers once they realize that I'm not going to tell anyone else and that they can just be honest with me about their thoughts and feelings. It's hard to measure these trends. Liberal women, it would be around 40% of them. So, liberal autistic women. For conservative women, it's around 10%. However, in some demographics of conservative women, it can be up to 40%,
Hmm.
especially in conservative women who have some sort of proximity to sexual violence or women who were raised conservative but are no longer in a conservative church but are still from those areas. It can get up to around 40%. Women in these demographics I often describe jokingly as sort of having sleeper cell radfem programming that gets awoken. We'll talk about that a little later.
You're not joking when
But
you say that.
no, I'm actually not joking. They are
That's serious.
the speed at which autistic Christian women raised in conservative environments move towards radical feminism once it's explained to them that this is a viable idea and a viable option
Yeah.
is much higher than you might initially think.
Well, I feel like often it's just like they already kind of put it together
Yes.
through the power of autism, and then it
Yes.
just clicks, and they're like, ah, yeah, I agree already.
Oh, there's a name for this.
Yeah, right.
It's or as one of my friends put it, oh, you guys needed a book to figure this out. That's cute.
Dang.
Yes. uh,
Savage.
yes. Through nothing but the sheer power of autism and the um, I'm trying
And
not
the
to
horror
stare.
of being a woman. Oh.
Yeah, through nothing but the sheer power of autism and the horror of being a woman, an autistic woman in conservative Christian spaces, they have derived radical feminism from first principles.
Do you
Um,
think you should cut this part out? Like, actually, but do you
it's
think?
staying in.
Yeah, you might leave it in anyway. Uh, do you think that like the difficulties of being a woman and like an autistic woman in like a conservative space is like it's harder than being a woman in like a progressive space, and so they're like more easily radicalized into radical
Yes,
feminism.
I think that is exactly why.
Oh, okay.
I think I think the
Not to say,
I
to be
think
clear, also I wouldn't want to be a woman in a progressive space either. Frankly, it sounds miserable. Being a woman in a space sounds pretty bad, but like,
yes, yeah. It sounds like you just don't like being a woman very much,
yeah,
which
being a woman isn't great. Being a woman in a progressive space doesn't necessarily appeal to me any more than being a woman in a conservative space.
I hate to tell this. I hate to break the news to you, Maddie, but this is a common sentiment shared by radical feminist women. In fact,
Okay, good, great.
our the patron saint of this podcast, Andrea Dworkin. That's a joke, by the way.
No, it's not.
It's mostly not a joke. Has a famous quote, and the quote is I'll probably get this wrong, but the quote is something like, "To conservative men, we are private property. To leftist men, we are public property."
Wow,
Um,
that's so true.
yeah. So anyway,
All
yeah.
right, yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm. Hmm. All right, we'll cut up that bit however you want.
Yeah, that's staying in. That's staying in. Um, but yeah, so basically, there are two places where most autistic Christian women will say, "I'm not going to follow radical feminists to these conclusions," and that's marriage and abortion. So
Hmm.
if you say, autistic Christian women will often say marriage is good and we should have marriage, and I'm not gonna attack marriage. I quite often they're like I quite like marriage. I think it's very good for me. I like being in my marriage. I
Yeah,
understand why other people don't like it, and I can
right.
see it going bad very quickly and very easily, but I'm not willing to sort of can the institution
I get
because
that. I'm a big
I
fan
think
of
it,
my husband.
yeah, I mean, that's generally what it is.
Yeah.
And then abortion. So we already talked about autistic attitudes towards abortion. Generally speaking, they think it's morally wrong. Whether it should be legally permissible is another question, but autistic women have attitudes, especially autistic conservative women will say, look, if the radfems didn't mention abortion and didn't mention marriage, like I would be there.
Mhm.
We'd be best friends. Um, there is both a very pronounced radical feminist to Christian pipeline within the autism community and Christian to radfem pipeline in especially with autistic women. The Christian to radfem pipeline is much more common than the radfem to Christian pipeline, but both
Mhm.
exist and both are very real. And I have,
Every day.
yes, I've walked a lot of radical feminists through the steps of Christianity and what Christianity is and explained it to them and the various ways that other autistic women interpret various problematic parts of Christianity in ways that they can handle, and they then convert to Christianity. I have also walked a lot of autistic Christian women through what radical feminism actually is and what the ideas of it are and what they think and what they don't think and what's caricature and what's accurate and not accurate. And let me tell you, the pipelines are there.
You're
So
building them
yeah,
every.
yeah. So this leads to the next part. So this is the part of the podcast where we talk about what is whether I really like it or not, the most interesting finding of all of my autism research.
Mm.
So, is it, when I say interesting, by the way, I'm not adding any sort of morality to this clause. I'm saying it is interesting insofar as it is anomalous. And it is not something that you expect, and it's not something I expected. In fact, it is not something I predicted. I predicted the exact opposite of what we're going to talk about when I first started my research. I did not see this trend coming. I started seeing this trend coming. I started warning people about this trend. They did not heed my warnings.
Okay,
We are
Cassandra.
now where we are. We're about to talk about anti trans sentiments within the autistic community.
You
So,
need like a bum bum bum.
yeah, bum, bum, bum. Yeah, exactly. Um, so, before we start, I'm going to make a distinction that I think is important to understanding this. So, there are two acronyms, or maybe three acronyms. So, Gender Critical Feminist, or there are sometimes called TERFs, Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. The only difference is gender critical feminist doesn't necessarily mean radical feminist, but most gender critical feminists are trans exclusionary radical feminists. And reactionary anti trans. So
Mm-hmm.
these are different things. People call Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire a TERF.
Do they
He's not a
really?
TERF.
Why
Yes.
did they call him a turf?
Because they don't understand what TERF means. They think
Who's
TERF
doing
means a person
this?
who doesn't like trans people.
All right,
That's
stop
not what
doing
TERF
that.
means.
If you're listening and you do that, stop.
Yes, Matt Walsh is a reactionary anti trans person. So,
Yeah.
gender critical feminists are anti trans, and they are anti trans on the basis of feminism, stemming from a desire to protect women from gender based violence. And they are very pro women, but they are pro women to the exclusion of trans women. That's what a gender critical feminist or a TERF is in a nutshell. A reactionary anti trans person is anti trans on the basis that they think trans people are weird degenerates and sexual deviants trying to destroy the West. And they aren't just anti trans, they're anti feminist, and they're often anti woman, and they're often sort of like, we need to return to patriarchy. We need to get women back in the kitchen, and we need to destroy the trans agenda. We need to restore traditional values and traditional gender roles.
Mm.
That is a very important difference to understand. These are not the same people. Do they sometimes appear in the same places? Yes. But gender critical feminists are, at their core, feminist. Reactionary anti trans are, at their core, reactionary. They want to bring society back in line with traditional values after they perceive we have gone into a state of cultural degeneracy.
Mm-hmm.
That is what the difference is.
Right.
Now, most autistic Christians are not reactionary anti trans. Most of them aren't. There are some who are, but the ones who are mostly conservative men and a very small minority of conservative women, autistic conservative men and autistic conservative women.
Right. Yeah.
Most anti trans sentiment that you will find in the autism community are gender critical feminists. So if you are looking for anti trans sentiment within autistic Christians, you will not find Matt Walsh. You will find Kathleen Stock. That's just
You
what it
gotta
is.
expound on that. That's
Okay, Matt Walsh is a Daily Wire correspondent who works for the Daily Wire, which is a right wing media organization, and Kathleen Stock is a famous UK professor who is a gender critical radical feminist.
right.
She is prominent voice on the gender critical radical feminist side of things.
Yeah. So like they're both anti-trans, but they
Yes.
had for different reasons. But-
Anti-trans coming from very different places want very different things for society and want very different outcomes.
to the point where like they probably like have them talk to each other and they would not get along.
Pretty much the only thing they agree on is they don't like trans people.
Yeah.
So, when you ask the question, do you agree with gender critical feminists? Or a lot of times you don't, if you don't say gender critical feminists, but you say, do you agree with these positions? And you lay out gender critical positions on things like the nature of sex and the nature of gender, or, for example, the nature of sex segregated spaces and who should and should not be allowed in those spaces, and at what point should they be included and excluded. If you ask these questions, basically the trends will track nearly exactly with the radfem sympathies question. They will lag slightly behind because there are some autistic women who are sympathetic with radical feminist ideas who are trans inclusive. You know, you have trans exclusive radical feminists, and then you have trans inclusive radical feminists, so TERFs, and like TERFs with an I.
Cheers.
Yes. Um, yeah. So unfortunately, TERF and TIRF are pronounced the same. But yeah. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that when you look at these tendencies, mo- pretty much they track exactly with the question: are you sympathetic to the ideas of radical feminism? And if you are, the chances that you agree with gender critical radical feminists are like 95%. A very small minority of these people will be trans inclusive, but they aren't trans inclusive. It is extremely hard to get these numbers. These numbers are shifting, and I'll talk about a little why in a little bit why it's really hard. I suspect, based on current trends and based on basically 10 years of doing trend analysis, these numbers are going to keep increasing. And how fast they're going to be increasing, I don't think they're going to increase super fast right now. I think we're approaching critical mass or critical latency, maybe.
Oh yeah.
We're at that point where all the ones who would have now joined. But as far as I can tell, just extrapolating from the data I have, these numbers are going to go up. The numbers are very hard to get, and I'll just say it because autistic women will straight up just lie to your face about it. So,
Many
why
such
do they
cases.
lie to me? Is a good question, and one I have had to ask a lot. So, around 20% of the autistic women that I have interviewed have straight up told me on these issues they have lied. They have
Does it
just
keep you
said,
up at night thinking about all the women who have lied to you?
I'm just like, why? Just tell me what you believe. I don't care.
They have
But the
no
thing
reason to
is,
trust you.
that's exactly it. They say, look, if I would have known that I could just trust you to not out me to other people or say things like this, and like once I knew that you were kind of dead inside and unable to emotionally react to this type of thing, um, or like once I knew that like your barrier for that I had to cross to be a terrible person was like ISIS. Once I
Mhm.
realized that, I was like, okay, sure,
It helps.
I
It's
can.
true. I've said some crazy stuff to you, and you're like,
Yes,
lol.
yes, literally. Usually, in order for a autistic Christian woman to tell me this, they need to develop a trust relationship with me. Once they develop a trust relationship with me, they will usually tell me this. And it's around 20% that have told me. I don't know what percentage haven't told me.
If you're out there, there's you can
Yes.
tell him. He's
Yes.
not gonna like. Actually, it'd be really funny if you just started tweeting like, so and so told me, that they're actually a turf.
So I will never do that. I will never reveal what anyone says, especially if they tell me not to reveal it. I did make a post about how autistic women do lie to me about it, and then I had 3 autistic women contact me and be like, "Lol, I did this too."
They're coming out of the woodwork.
Yes, yes. When I just said that this happens, and they're like, "Oh, other women do that." I should message John and tell him I also did this.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get exact numbers.
Was that
Now,
was the post with the meme of like the wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I can see why they lie to people because several people were very unhappy about the state of autistic Christian women based
Yes.
on your post.
I mean, rightfully so. If you're trans and
Yeah.
you're learning that a lot of autistic Christian women don't like you, that probably isn't a super happy experience to have. I'm sure there are
Mhm.
trans people listening to the podcast going, "What the hell?" um,
Right. And
totally
we
understand
support
that.
if you're out there.
Yes, we agree with you if you're out there.
Yeah.
Yep, but around 25% said, "I didn't lie to you, but I
Mm.
changed my mind on this issue. When you
Mm.
interviewed with me, I actually believed what I told you. I have since reconsidered my views and have changed." That is 1 in 4 interviews I've done with cisgender autistic women. That
Over
is
how many
so high.
years?
Well,
What's
over 10 years.
okay? Yeah,
Yeah, but 1 in 4
that's a lot.
changing from pro-trans to anti-trans, and specifically anti-trans gender critical feminist, is a very high. And 20% saying I lied to you. That's like
That's a
45%.
statistic that you have not. I haven't heard that one, and this is our
Yeah.
third time recording this.
Yes.
That's really
I
high.
initially wasn't going to say it because, yeah. Anyway, I was peer pressured into saying it. They're like,
Oh
you should
yeah,
give your actual numbers. I'm fine. I'll give my actual numbers.
was that one
This
of the
is what it
notes?
is. Yes. Yes.
Don't
One of
sound
the
so
notes
nervous
was
and give us the numbers.
yes. Yes. That was basically it. Um. So why does this happen? Why doth thou lie to John in his autism research?
Stop lying to John. It
I
makes me so sad.
He can't accurately track trends. He doesn't care about he doesn't
he
feel anything inside. He just wants to know numbers.
he
It's
likes
you're
numbers.
denying Yes, you're denying him his special interest, which is figuring out what autistic people think about things. Um, really, it's ableism to lie to me.
It
Um,
is. You're being
when you think
ableist if
about it,
you lie to John about being a turf.
yes, yes. So just be honest to me. So I understand why this happens, right? I understand why autistic women do this. And the
Mhm.
reason that autistic women do this is
I would
because the
lie to you.
autism community is overwhelmingly progressive.
Right.
And so the default assumption is that if you're talking to someone in the autism community who's doing autism advocacy and working with autistic people and often very friendly with a lot of autistic trans people, and I make no secret of the fact that I have many trans friends, and I make no secret of the fact that I generally have a very low opinion of reactionary anti trans people, and especially reactionary anti trans people when they post very dumb things about autism and trans stuff. I make no
Oh
secret of the
yeah.
fact that I think they are idiots. A lot of autistic women will be like, I'm not going to say this because I quite like John and I like the conversation we're having. And
Oh.
I think he's a cool guy, and I want him to be on friendly terms with me. And I think that he won't be on friendly terms with me if I tell him this, because he'll think I'm bigoted and he won't want to engage with me. He won't want to talk to me. And I'm really interested in learning more about autism and Christianity. And so I want to keep this social relationship open. When I ask them why they lie to me, they usually say something like that they are worried that I'm going to socially ostracize them for telling me their views. And then they're like, and then I realized that you're spiritually dead inside and you don't have any feelings, and that you are pathologically incapable of passing judgment on people for the weird things they say online because your brain has been fried of 10 years of autism research, so nothing surprises you anymore. Um, and then once they realize that, they tell me.
That's not
So,
true. It's because they realize that your weird little guys are them.
okay, well, that too. So
That's nice though that they like you.
another big reason is that I've started talking a lot more about my experience doing counter trafficking stuff, and I
Mm.
will be a lot more overt about my sympathies to radical feminists as a result of doing that counter trafficking work. And they think, oh, he might not agree with me, but at least he'll be willing to hear me out, and he will be willing to be sympathetic to me in a way that some autistic people wouldn't, and he will be
Some,
more likely to get it.
I think some might be generous.
What do you mean?
I think you're probably, when it comes to this topic, you're probably generous in a way that like most autistic people wouldn't be.
Okay. I thought you meant the number would be higher, and I'm like, I don't think it
No,
would
no,
be
no.
higher. Okay, yeah. Anyway, so because of that, they realize that they don't have to lie to me, and so long as they aren't like ISIS or like an overt Nazi, I'm going to be fine with whatever they say.
So keep
And
lying to
so,
John if you're ISIS.
yes, if you are ISIS, you should lie to me about that. um, yeah, so often they don't want to lose friends, they don't want to lose social relationships, and they don't want me to think poorly of them, and
Oh,
so
sad.
they don't tell me that. So it is fairly common at this point for the following thing to happen. Initially, they'll be like, TERFs? No, I'm not a TERF. I don't agree with them. They're the worst. I hate those people. And then as we talk, like 3 months later ish, they'll be like, well, you know, maybe they don't always make the worst points, but, I still don't agree with them, obviously. And like,
Mm.
they're
Mm-hmm.
obviously wrong and they're bigoted and I disavow.
It's
And then
convincing.
6 months later, they're like, I'm not a TERF, but I think people are kind of unfair to them. And I think that sometimes they have reasonable concerns. I'm like,
Wow, subtle. That's subtle.
wow, so subtle. I wonder what's coming. Because my
Autistic women are
response,
so subtle. I love that
yes,
about
if
us.
there's one thing that I know about autistic women is their social subtlety is just impeccable. Um, it's really funny because they honestly think they're being subtle, and then like a few months after that, they'll come to me and they'll be like, "Okay, confession time. I'm a TERF, and
Mm.
I have been for the last 3 years, but I thought you would judge me, so I pretended I wasn't." This has happened so many times. Not exactly like that, not always in that timeline, but the amount of autistic women who have confessed to me that they kind of agree with TERFs is kind of alarming. How many times it's happened?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I used to assume that a autistic Christian woman was going to be more progressive than autistic men on social issues.
Mm.
So, because that was the trend, especially from 2014 to 2017, I made that assumption. I no longer make that assumption when it comes to trans issues because of the sheer amount of stuff that I've heard from autistic Christian women. The only times that I make exceptions for that is if I'm talking to a cis autistic Christian woman and she has recently converted and is in an extremely progressive church, then I'll assume she's trans inclusive. If she's liberal or like liberal Protestant or progressive and like in a church that has a rainbow flag in it, if they use the term queer or bi to identify themselves, if they use the term lesbian, you still can't tell. You never know
That's
what's going to
fair.
happen next. But
Yeah.
if they say they're queer or if they say they're bi, then they're probably trans inclusive.
Yeah.
If they are trans or have a lot of close trans friends or non-binary friends, or if they are heavily involved in a progressive style activist cause.
That could
If
be
they
a
don't
plot.
meet any Yeah,
Like
if
a
they don't meet any of those criteria, I no longer assume that they are more progressive than autistic men on these issues.
yeah, that's fair.
So,
Then you just wait for them to come
yeah,
out of the turf
I
closet.
at this point, just having done this a lot, I now pretty much assume that a cis autistic woman is going to be at least sympathetic to some forms of gender critical feminism, if not fully on board with it, unless they meet one of those conditions. In general, autistic men, however, are way more trans accepting and affirming than autistic women. And this is weird. So, this is weird because every single demographic that I have been able to find where there has been research, about attitudes towards trans identity. In every case, men are less affirming than women, except for autistic Christians. It's weird. I
Yeah.
don't know why this is. Unfortunately, like this fun fact is probably like the most interesting, clinically significant, or like statistically significant finding of my research. And so
Crazy.
if I wanted to publish something about my research, it would be this trend. But also, like, I don't know if people would like to talk about this particularly. Um,
But you're neutral.
yes, this I will say this is also a finding that is very hard to replicate without doing long form, long term interview processes where you're developing trust relationships with the people you're talking with. I don't know. I would have never detected this trend had I not been doing long form interviews where I develop trust relationships with the participants and where I continuously follow up with them over time.
Well, I don't know. If it was like anonymous or like if you were a nameless, faceless researcher and it was just like a survey, do you think they'd be more likely to like say what they actually think or
Here's the thing, they straight up tell me that they lied on my anonymous surveys that I put out.
oh, okay. So like no incentive,
Yep.
just lying.
Yep. They said they lied on those surveys because they didn't want to give the impression that autistic Christian women aren't accepting of trans people. And I'm like,
But
okay, but you're not.
well,
And they're
that
like,
okay.
well, like, I didn't want you to think
They're
autistic
really
Christian
saving
women were
face.
bad. And it's like, okay, this is an anonymous survey. And you're like, yeah, but there was a gender tick. So, okay. um, anyway,
Wow, that's
a
really
lot of
interesting.
them, a lot of them also, if you put on a survey, I am inclusive and accepting of trans people, they will put agree. And then if you put another line that has an explicit turf talking point in it, like, I believe there should be single sex spaces and we should be allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex assigned at birth,
They'll say
they
yeah.
will say yes, agree.
Oh, crazy.
And so they will call themselves trans inclusive, but they will also say we should be allowed to kick trans women out of single sex spaces. And so it's like, do you know what trans inclusive means? And a lot of them often think it means being nice and polite to trans people,
Which you should do probably.
which most autistic Christian women are.
Yeah.
And a lot of these autistic Christian women have trans friends or non binary friends, and they will like them and they'll be nice to them.
Yeah.
However, when you ask them about ontologically, though, what is your trans friend, they will say they are their sex assigned at birth.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of, this is just another social thing that we're playing along with. And they'll say, I am trans inclusive. And
Oh,
it's like,
autistic people playing
that is
along with
not trans
social
inclusive.
things that they don't agree with or understand. That's so unusual.
Yes. Like, literally, I've had to tell autistic women who describe themselves as trans inclusive that saying, I consider trans women honorary women, is not trans inclusive. They don't realize it's not trans inclusive. But I have to tell them that's not the trans inclusive position. They're not
Mm.
honorary women, they are women. That is the trans position. And they're like, well, yeah, but like, like, it's, and like, no, you don't understand. It's not a, well, it's a ontological is. And they go, ooh, I didn't know that. And so this is a really hard question to survey for. And this is
Yeah.
really hard to actually develop unless you, one, really know the discourse
Yeah.
and really know the questions and really know the edge cases and you really know what all the sides are saying about this, which unfortunately I've had to do in order to get to the bottom of this issue.
Right.
And so, like, on the surface level, most autistic Christian women are accepting. They will do all the inclusive stuff. They will use proper pronouns. They will not use dead names. They will do all the right things. And then also, when the door closes, they'll be like, yeah, but like, come on, really? Um, that's that's the reality. That is the reality that I have found doing this research. So surface level inclusive, get below the surface or close the door, and they go a little like, hmm, okay though, but like we all know that, and it's like, no, we don't all know. Like you hold trans exclusionary positions. Like, no, I don't, and I have to lay out these are what trans exclusionary positions are. You agree with 9 out of 10 of these. What would I call someone who is 90% in agreement with one position and 10% in agreement with the other? Let's not label these turf and trans inclusive. Let's label them
Right.
group A, group B. If I were to say you agree 90% with group A and 10% with group B, which group are you? You're group A. I don't know how else to tell you this.
So if you're a trans person listening, uh, this is either reassuring that like the Turks will probably be nice to you, or very scary that like the Turks don't know their terms.
Yes, I think this is a overall bad thing for trans people. It is not good for these autistic women to be like this in these groups with trans people. I will explain a little more why later. Um, there is basically no demographic in which I've found this to be the case. That being said, I have not done a control, like I have not cornered Christian women who aren't autistic and been like, okay, but like seriously, what do you actually think about gender?
You probably shouldn't corner women. It's a bad
I'm
thing.
not going to do that. Yeah, like I'm a 6'7", 280 pound guy. Like that's
Yeah.
probably a bad idea in general. But like these, yeah, it is an anomaly though, and it is an anomaly across every demographic that I can find because autistic men are way more trans affirming than autistic women, at least like in principle. So autistic men are very unlikely to say something like, "Well, yeah, like this is just a thing we're going along with, right? Like we don't
Autistic
actually
Christian
believe
men,
this." Autistic Christian men, sorry,
but
yes.
also probably autistic men in general.
Yeah, autistic men. Here's the thing. Autistic women who aren't Christian are very likely to be pro-trans.
Right.
It's just when you add Christian in the mix that things flip, and they only flip for women.
Well, do you? I get. I mean, you haven't talked to like as the group of autistic women who aren't Christian, but do you think there would be the same like they think that like the trans thing is just like something everyone's going along with out of politeness?
I have no idea. I don't think so. I have no idea though. Like I straight up just I'm not even going to speculate because I just don't have the
That's
data
good.
for that. Um,
Do the men
yeah,
do that? Did you ask the men? For that?
no, men don't do that.
Okay,
So
so they're like
autistic men,
often they're
autistic
like
men are overall way more likely to not think it's a social fiction and to be like, yeah, no, they are actually closer in line with progressive orthodoxy than autistic Christian women. So, in general, gender critical feminist autistic Christian women are generally speaking over the age of 25. They are often mothers or they have specific sorts of female health concerns. And so if they're not mothers, have other specific female reproductive issues.
mm,
If they were raised conservative, if they have a conservative affect, if they are from the UK, and if they have proximity to gender-based violence. If they meet these criterias, they will probably be more aligned with gender critical feminists. Now, I get the question, is
yeah.
this just an older generation thing where the younger generation is more trans inclusive? And the answer is not really. The
Mm,
only anomalous section of the demographic is younger millennial women. That is the only place where you find more trans inclusiveness. Autistic Christian women
okay,
who are
that makes
Zoomers,
sense. Or
Like
that
the
sounds like
Zoomer,
millennials.
yes, the Zoomer autistic Christian women, or like the Zoomer or like the Zillennial autistic Christian women are not super on board with it. It is, yeah. Anyway, people have asked me, like, do you think that this age will continue to go up? And I have actually not seen it go up. So the average age used to be above 28.
Hmm.
It is now at 25. So the average age has actually gone down.
Well, there you
So
go.
this isn't a generational thing. This isn't a I just don't understand this. This is a legitimate trend.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about autistic Christian men.
Yeah.
Autistic Christian men overall are pretty chill about trans issues. Just like
Hmm.
they're go with the flow, they're laissez faire. Autistic Christian men, for whatever reason, are much more likely than autistic Christian women to see trans people as the gender which they identify, even amongst conservative men. And especially if those conservative men know a trans person in real life. They are way more likely to just have a live and let live attitude and sort of shrug it off like, look, if they're not hurting anyone, just let them be. Or,
Meritocratic egalitarian.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, default meritocratic egalitarian attitude, where
Hmm.
they'll also be like, look, these people clearly have a lot going on, and far be it from me to judge someone who's a little bit weird. Like, I'm autistic. I'm surrounded by weirdos all day. What's another weird thing for me to deal with? Like, this isn't a big deal. This isn't something that I care about. And there's often in autistic men a strong impulse to see trans women as a socially marginalized group that needs help and support. And they'll be like, hey, these might be weirdos, but they're my weirdos. And
Mm,
I'm going to fight for them. And I think they should be protected. And they really don't like the way that TERFs act online or gender critical feminists act online. They think they're mean and they think they're bullying, and they're bullying my friends, and I don't like them. And
right.
there's a sort of negative polarization against anti trans sentiment for a lot of autistic Christian men.
Hmm. Autistic people do tend to be like, those are my weird little guys. Leave them alone.
Yes, that tendency also exists with autistic Christian women. They just sort of segment things off in their brain where they say they're one of the good ones. Um,
Right.
and yes, with all the implications that come along with that. The autistic Christian men
All
who
the
are anti
implications.
trans are pretty much all reactionary anti trans. You very rarely find a gender critical feminist anti trans autistic man. They are almost all just Matt Walsh Daily Wire fans. The trans degeneracy needs to be stopped. We need to return to traditional values, that type of thing. Um,
Hey,
yeah.
if you're out there though, if you're a gender critical autistic Christian man who is not a Matt Walsh type, shout out to you. You're rare.
Yep, you are a very rare species indeed. So, transphobia in autistic men is very easy to explain. There's a sort of fear of being gay or gay panic. They're like, "Oh no, I've been tricked," or
Hmm.
like they think they're like on a crusade to protect the purity of women, or they're like, these trans people are destroying traditional family values and the traditional family unit, and they're trying to fight against patriarchy, and we need to enforce this. We need to protect the West, or we need to protect Christian values, or
Right.
we need to stop the degeneracy. And their issues with trans people is that they're delusional and they aren't making sense, or they're degenerate or something like that. And so they are often very, very culture war coded. Like, take whatever culture war talking point you want, you'll probably find that there. Autistic Christian men are also not socially compliant if they're anti trans, meaning it is very rare for you to find an autistic Christian man who is anti trans and not willing to just say it to your face and be like, yeah, I don't like trans people. I'm not going to use their pronouns. I'm not going to use the name, their chosen name. I'm going to dead name them if I know it. you know,
Right.
they're going to say, I don't respect their gender identity. I'm not going to respect anything about this. This is delusion and degeneracy. It stops here, type of thing. They will often be overtly hostile to trans people, or if they're not overtly hostile, they will they will not hide their contempt. Like it will be very clear they don't like trans people. They will make it clear, or they will just like if they meet one in real life, they'll just pretend they don't exist, or they'll you know be aggro towards them. That's what autistic Christian men who are anti-trans are like. Autistic Christian women, on the other hand, very different bag. Most autistic Christian women are gender critical, feminist. So they are specifically coming at this from a feminist perspective, and they are way more complicated. And from like just a trans inclusion side of things, they are probably way more problematic than the autistic Christian men, because autistic Christian men are just overt about it, right? And they make it known, and you
Yeah.
can easily identify, oh, this person is anti-trans, this person is like a danger to us.
They
Autistic
are
Christian women,
exactly what they present themselves to be.
yes. Autistic Christian women are often not. The vast majority are socially compliant, at least at the surface level, with trans stuff. So, the only exception to this I've found are autistic Christian women who live exclusively in conservative social spaces. So, if you're very conservative and you're in a Christian conservative space, then yeah. Um, these
I wasn't
autistic
making that
women.
face, by the way.
Okay,
I was choking on a tea leaf. That's fine.
classic. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So these autistic women will use trans pronouns. They won't dead name people, or they'll make a conscious effort to not dead name them. They will often correct people in public if they use the wrong pronouns. Like they will be socially compliant.
Yeah.
Um, they are often very conscious about the fact that they're anti-trans, and they try very hard to blend in, and often by their own reports to me they will tell me that they intentionally overcompensate so
Oh,
that
yeah.
people don't suspect them of being the bad person,
Yeah.
and they
All
will
right.
often take a lot of efforts to appear accepting for the sake of social inclusion until they believe they're with someone that they can share their truth with, basically. They are, so to speak, in the closet about these views, but they often still very much hold them.
Mm.
The
Mm.
phrase that I was specifically given many, many times, so this isn't one person, this is many autistic Christian women who use this phrase, is they
Many.
say something to the effect of, I will eat the meat sacrificed to the idols. I will be all things to all people. I will do what Paul said I should do. So
Is
for
that
those
a
who don't know,
is that a
this is
direct
a
quote
reference.
from the women, or are you
This is
paraphrasing?
a summation of many different quotes into
Okay.
one.
They're all quoting
And
Paul.
they are all using Paul's analogy of
Okay.
what you should do.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
they
I get that.
they are saying essentially, and many of them have specifically used the eat meat sacrifice to idols thing. So for those who don't know, there's this
Crazy.
part in the New Testament where there's a controversy in the church about whether or not you should eat meat that is sacrificed to idols. And Paul basically says, yeah, do it. Like, if it causes scandal for someone, then don't. But, like, it's fine. You can do it. Just do whatever you need to do. Or be, I am all things to all people, is something
Yeah.
Paul is famous for saying. Many of them will say that, and they will say, look, I'll use their pronouns. I will use their name. I will treat them as a woman unless something like there's a really specific precondition. The vast majority of autistic Christian women are in spaces where explicitly stating these views will often get them marginalized
Mm-hmm.
or like cut out of those spaces, and they don't want to. They don't want to lose friends. They don't want their friends to think badly of them.
Yeah.
And so often what they will do is they will hide it and then subtly sow seeds of discontent in the safety and cloak it in plausible deniability. One of them told me that they do something that they call tactical misgendering or tactical dead naming.
Oh yeah. Wait, that's
Intentionally.
their analogy, not yours.
Huh? I mean,
That's
I call
their.
it tactical dead naming. They don't call it
Oh, okay.
tactical dead naming. Um, but what they say is they will use the correct pronouns 98% of the time, but they're
Oh.
very intentional about not doing it 2% of the time
Mm.
because they are intentionally trying to be cruel to the trans people that they know in their group. And they
Subtle.
know, yes, it is very diabolical and underhanded, but they'll be like, "Oh, oops. Oh, sorry, I just made a mistake. That's my fault. Didn't mean to do that." And they'll just intentionally do it sometimes.
Wow, that's so sneaky.
Yes, most of them will not show up on surveys, even anonymous surveys. Most of them are not turfs, so to speak. They are what I call crypto turfs. So
Crypto turfs.
crypto turfs. So
Crypto
like
turfs.
they not cryptocurrency, but like turfs in secret. They're
Right.
not out loud. They do not let other people know about this. Basically, if you want to find it, you have to develop a trust relationship with these people, and you have to be very, very specific about the types of questions you ask, and you have to word them extremely specifically. You have to give precise scenarios, and then you have to ask them, okay, what about this? What about this? And often you have to signal that you yourself will not be offended by them expressing these things, because often autistic Christian women don't want to offend you. They want to appear as normal. Anyway, it is genuinely hard to get exact ratios. There are quite a lot of them, especially in the UK, and especially places that aren't overtly progressive or involved in activism. So, like, if your church doesn't have a pride flag outside of it, if it does have a pride flag outside of it, or especially a trans flag, chances are there aren't many crypto turfs there. If it doesn't, um, you know, I don't know. I did not expect it to be nearly as common as I did. I don't want to give the impression that every autistic Christian woman is just secretly a turf. That is not what reality is. It's just they are there. And they're often very underhanded and subversive in the things they do, and they cloak things in plausible deniability. And honestly, if I wasn't an army officer trained to do intelligence and counterintelligence work, I would probably have never noticed this. I would have
Oh
probably
yeah.
never noticed the signs, and I would have probably never noticed that this is happening, especially in the early days. And so
Well, thank
while they
goodness you
are,
are.
yeah, yeah, yes. So, so like while they are anti-trans, they're not as explicit, and like like I said, some don't even realize they're anti-trans. Some just hold anti-trans views and think these are the progressive views or these are the right views to have. But like you talk to them and you're like, look, this isn't like you just said you're trans inclusive, but you 2 seconds ago you just said something that wasn't trans inclusive. And they're like, no, that's trans inclusive. And it's like that opinion is on the extreme end of trans medicalism. So like that is an opinion that would not be accepted by the vast majority of trans people. That would
I don't know if you want to define transmedicalism, but maybe you should.
Okay, so transmedicalism is the idea that the only valid transgender identities are those trans people who have gone through a full medical transition. And so they have been taking hormones for a set period of time. The hormones have successfully worked, and they have underwent surgery of various types. So they will say something like, well, of course a trans woman is a woman after she gets surgery. And it's like, that's not a progressive opinion for your information. Like that
This
is
was decided back when I was in like high school. I remember the
yes,
YouTube
yes.
back and
This
forths about it.
Yes, this is what is the true scum too cute debate for any of those who have been
If
in
any
the
of you were
Tumblr
here for
trenches.
that.
Yes. Um, this is decidedly not the progressive opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway, so another thing I do is I just say, "What do you think about this issue?" And I just don't give them feedback. I just ask what they think, and then they'll tell me it, and they'll give me a turf position. I'll go, "Okay, cool." And then 5 minutes later, they'll be like, "Yeah, so I'm trans inclusive. I'm not a turf." And it's like, "Well, what was that all about? Like 5 minutes ago?" And then I'll ask them, and they'll be like, "That's not the turf position." And then I have to send them like YouTube videos of trans people explaining the turf position, and they'll be like, "Oh," or I'll send them turf videos of turfs explaining the positions, and they'll be like, "Oh, okay." um, so so these women, I should characterize them. They are overwhelmingly feminist. They are overwhelmingly pro women. They are progressive on pretty much every other issue, with a sort of live and let people be weird attitude. They have that default meritocratic egalitarianism deeply baked inside of them. However, in private, or sort of unbeknownst to them, they hold the anti-trans positions. But they will be nice and socially compliant in public. Their positions are often misunderstood by their opponents, and so like just to be clear, these are not Matt Walsh types. They are not reactionary. They don't want to return to traditional roles. They very much do not want to return to traditional gender roles or do any of the trad stuff. They are not motivated by disgust. When you ask them, why do you hold these positions, they will say, look, I have a lot of sympathy and understanding for trans men, but I have a lot of suspicion and contempt for trans women. They see men as a category, as a serious threat to women, and women as a class, as a group of people who are vulnerable and need protection from the violence against men, and they will be biological essentialists. So they will explicitly say trans women are still men, and women still need protection from them because they are not women. They are men. Again, this is their position. They often are very clear that they see trans men as sort of women who've been harmed by gender transition. They will see gender transition as like something that they think is an attack on women themselves, because again they have a idea of gender essentialism where you can't change these things, and so these are women who are undergoing surgery or things like that that would normally be gender nonconforming women, or like, our lost lesbian sisters, and that they have been sold gender transition as a solution to their problems that isn't right. They will often say these are vulnerable women who have other mental health issues, who were victimized by an overly ambitious medical system who brought them into the trans fad. They will often point to autistic women detransitioners and be like, see, this is what I mean. This is what we said was going to happen, and this is what happened. Now, I just feel the obligation to point this out because I know people will point it out. I'm very aware this is not how trans men self conceptualize. What I'm doing is I'm trying to explain how anti trans autistic Christian women conceptualize trans men. So, just to
Yeah.
be really
We
clear,
agree with you if you believe that, though.
sure.
And if you
um,
don't believe it, then we agree with you too.
yes, yes, that's important. Um, yeah. Again, I want to make it clear this is not all autistic Christian women who hold these positions. I don't want to make it seem like they are lurking behind every corner and just secretly waiting to tell you they're anti trans. This is, however, a lot of them. This is far more than I thought there would initially be. And they're often like, I'm not saying that every autistic Christian woman is rabidly transphobic. I don't want to give the wrong impression if you are trans and listening to this and going like, holy shit, this is scary. I understand why it might sound like that. But
Yeah, fair.
I don't know how else to communicate the fact that a lot of autistic Christian women are like, yeah, not super on board with this. That being said, if you are trans and you're like, oh no, is everyone in my church transphobic? The answer is probably no, because you're probably going to a church
Yeah.
that is accepting of trans people. And
If
if
you're
the
there,
church,
it's
yes, if you are there, you are probably going to a church that is explicitly affirming of trans people. And these autistic women typically don't go to those churches. Sometimes they do, though, but they're in the minority. So, yeah, I just don't want to I don't want to overblow the problem or make it seem like it's like they're in the trees. I
they're probably not in the trees. We're not
They're
very
probably not in the trees.
autistic women.
They are probably on Twitter secretly judging you, but you know, I don't know what to tell you. Like this is a thing though, and it's also a thing that's very hard to find, and you won't know unless you're looking for it and you develop trust relationships with these people because they will often be crypto about it.
Yeah. Take heart in the fact that they'll be like severely ostracized if they disagree with
Yes,
you, I guess.
yes, they will often not be overt about it because they are very concerned about social ostracization
Yeah.
over expressing their actual views. So, the question I get, why is there a sex difference? Why are men chill and more relaxed? Why don't they care?
I mean,
Why is
that's
it autistic Christian women?
they've been
Why
like that
is
for a
it
lot of these questions though.
what?
Like like men have been like relaxed and caring less about like every issue we've gone over.
True, but like,
But why this one?
why this one? Why is this one? Why are autistic women negatively polarized against trans people when autistic men are just more chill? So, we talked about views of sex in the last episode, but something I didn't really mention was that autistic women tend to be much. So, the majority view, like we said, is sex is fixed, and that is the majority view that you'll get from autistic people. However, what we didn't really go into is how convinced about that they are. And like just as a general rule, autistic Christian women are much more likely to be like hard convinced of a sort of bioessentialism or a sort of gender essentialism. So they are more likely to be like, yeah, this is absolutely the case, and there's nothing that's going to change my mind. Where autistic Christian men are like, I think this is true, but like they're way more willing to accept feedback, way more willing to accept pushback, way more willing to say, yeah, like I'm wrong about this, or I might be wrong, or, caveat their responses. Autistic Christian women are often like, nah, no, I know I'm right on this issue. Like, and there isn't much you could do to convince me otherwise. So men are much more laissez-faire about questions of sex and gender, sort of live and let live attitude, and they are way more willing to concede or say I might be wrong than autistic Christian women who are just like, nope, nope, this is the correct view, this is the right way to think about it. Another big factor is just information diet and exposure. So people are in their own little bubbles on the internet, and the woman internet is different than the man internet. And TERFs, or gender critical feminists, are overwhelmingly women, and so they hang out on the women internet and they post on the women internet. And so if you just think about this as sheer exposure to talking points, autistic men probably get about 5% of what autistic women do when it comes to gender critical talking points.
That makes
Unless
sense.
you are a very progressive person, in that case, you probably get not a lot of
Yeah.
anti trans talking points. But if you are a conservative Christian man, you probably don't get a lot of gender critical feminist talking points. If you are an autistic Christian woman, you probably get a lot of them. You probably hear a lot of them, and you probably just get far more exposure. And generally speaking, the more exposure you have to information, the more likely you are to be convinced by it. Autistic Christian women also have a lot more exposure to things like sexual violence and gender based violence from men. So they know that it is often because they are a woman that they are exposed to this. And so they have a much more visceral reaction to a lot of gender critical feminist talking points, because gender critical feminist talking points use heavily in their rhetoric, they use the specter of male violence. And so if you talk to an autistic Christian man and you say, the specter of male violence is haunting us, they'll go, no, not really. Like, this isn't a thing. And, like, you know, I'm a man, I'm not violent, that type of thing. But you say that to an autistic Christian woman, and she's like, yes, I know it is. So for autistic Christian women, just the amount of brain space that gets taken up thinking about gender-based violence versus the average man is much larger in the average autistic Christian woman. And because so much of gender critical talking points rely on using the specter of male violence to convince people, that's just going to be way more effective on autistic women than it will be on autistic men. Yeah, well, like the easiest way to explain it basically is to just think of all the push factors that bring people into gender critical radical feminism, and the pull factors that the pull factors that bring them in, or the push factors that push them out. And the easiest way to think about this is to just think of all the things pulling them in and all of them pushing them out. Most of the pull factors associated with gender critical feminism don't really have an effect on autistic men. They're not rhetorically effective on men. They're not written by men for men. They're written by women. And so they're really only going to affect women. For example, if you talk about gender-based violence and sexual objectification, autistic men aren't really going to think about it much. And it's not going to really pull them towards gender critical feminism. You say that to an autistic Christian woman, that will.
Crazy.
Yeah. There are other push factors, right? And the push factors have significantly more effect on autistic men. So the push factors that push people away from gender critical feminism is, I don't want to be mean to my trans friends, basically. I don't want to be mean to trans people. I don't like being mean to trans people. I am a default meritocratic egalitarian, don't you know? Like,
Right.
just as long as they're not hurting people, I don't care. And so autistic Christian men also, just in general, they're more empathetic with trans women. Like, they are more likely to say, I understand this, and like they seem like they're going through a rough time, and you know, we should help them because they're going through a rough time, and we should just do whatever makes sense. So you have those none of the pull factors are bringing autistic men in, but a lot of the push factors are pushing them away.
Right. That
And
makes sense.
if you are autistic, the chances that you have proximity to trans people is quite high. So autistic people are disproportionately trans and disproportionately no trans people.
Probably because they
So
disproportionately know autistic people.
yes, probably there's just a lot of overlap between the two communities. And so because they're not really getting pulled in, they get pushed out.
They get pushed out, yeah.
But for autistic women, they still have the same push factors, but they have a sort of overwhelming set of other pull factors.
Right. And it's issues that, like, as we've established in the other podcasts that I've been here for, are like very strongly important
Yes.
to autistic women.
Yes. And that's basically why there's a sex difference and why the sex difference is so severe. Basically, turf talking points are designed for autistic Christian women in a way that they're not designed for autistic Christian men. And
And they
so
fall for
just
it.
yeah, in terms of information warfare, it's just like you have a targeted payload for one specific group that doesn't
Yeah.
work on the other group, and boy are they pushing that payload, and they are pushing it hard.
That's such a John
Yeah,
sentence. Oh my gosh.
it is. It is. I'm sorry. I'm terminally army brained. Anyway,
You are.
so why specifically is there a difference between non-Christian autistic women and Christian autistic women? Like, why is it that autistic women are more trans inclusive than autistic men, but autistic Christian women are less trans inclusive than autistic Christian men? You know, why aren't autistic women TERFs in the same way that non-autistic women, that autistic Christian women are TERFs? And
Any
that
more
is
ways
a
you can
great
rephrase
question.
that?
What?
Any more ways you can rephrase that?
I don't know. So like,
I hope they got the idea.
yeah, why does this anomaly exist?
Right.
So there are a few reasons. One, in autism communities, there is a very, very heavy anti-turf push. So
Hmm.
if you are a turf and you say you're a turf in an autism community, you're going to get booted.
Yeah. It's the good person, bad person question.
Yes.
But
If
the
you are
yeah,
in a Christian community, less likely.
they
So,
probably won't know what that is, actually.
yes. Or they'll be like, oh, you don't like trans people, but for weird reasons? Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
I guess. Why not? um, Autistic Christian women, at least from what I've been able to tell from my talks with non Christian autistic women, are way more likely to be biological essentialists or see having a sexed or gendered body or like mind or sexuality as a sort of inescapable fact of reality.
Mhm.
So autistic Christian women are much harder biological essentialists than autistic women as a whole.
Right.
Autistic Christian women are way more likely to exist in places where turfs also exist, just in general. Like on the gender critical feminist side of the internet, there is a Christian gender critical feminist alliance. And so if you are a Christian and you're an autistic woman, the chances that you will encounter turf talking points are significantly higher than if you're not a Christian.
Right.
Generally speaking, autistic people get pulled toward radicalization. So if there is a pull to like anti pro trans radicalization, you get pulled there. But if there's a stronger pull to anti trans radicalization, you get pulled there. It's just how autistic people are. And a lot of what gender critical feminism does is they provide a sort of intellectualization for why being trans exclusionary is justified. And they're not very culture worry. Well, some of them aren't very culture worry. Some of them are, but yeah, that is kind of why I think there is a difference between non-Christian women and Christian women when it comes to this topic, and specifically autistics. Is I think it's some combination of those factors. So we are going to indulge me for a small bit, and I'm going to talk about my research and how
Yeah.
I noticed that this actually exists. Just kidding. I lied. This podcast is already getting way too long, and I got most of the points across. If this is a topic that people are actually interested in, I can go into this in a future episode. If I get feedback from this episode where you say, I actually want to know more about this and I want to understand why these things are happening or understand the trends better and sort of get a better inside perspective into how you did all this analysis and how these trends came to be and how you found they were a thing, I would be happy to do that, but we're already at like 2 hours and 20 minutes, so I'm just not going to subject you to another 2 hours of me explaining to Maddie all of my various trials and tribulations, trying to establish this, and then explaining why and how, more specifically, the autistic Christian woman to anti trans gender critical feminist comes to be. So that's where I'm going to cut off this episode. If you guys actually want to hear about that part, I can let you guys in on it in the next episode. And yeah, but that's all I'm going to do for this week. I don't want to publish a 4.5 hour long podcast about this. Anyway, that's all I've got. If you want to find me or you want to email me, you can find me at Christianity on the Spectrum. You can find me on Twitter at Christianity On and Blue Sky at Christianity On. If you want to find Maddie, you can find her at Fickle Frontier. She goes by Bronzor on Twitter. All right. Yep, sort of abruptly cut off the podcast. It was just getting way too long and maybe got into subject matter that would make people uncomfortable. So we're just cutting it here. All right. See y'all later. Bye.